This is a longer version of a presentation I gave at the 2016 Midwest Society of Christian Philosophers Conference. The conference's theme was on Christian philosophy and public engagement, which I think is a very worthwhile pursuit. When I heard the topic, I thought I'd had a great essay on Persuasion per Aquinas sitting in my pocket that I'd written up for a course I took on Aquinas, and that I'd just add some examples to the essay, beef it up a bit, and be good to go. But beefing it up turned into this huge task, and the actual essay is now about 30 pages long. My wife says I always overdo things, and in this case, she's definitely right about that. So because of time limits, I had to cut many things from my presentation at the conference. Additionally, several people at the conference pointed to some problematic elements in the last section, so I've changed that section a bit in this presentation as well as the essay to address those concerns. Now, the purpose of my essay is to see how the writings and philosophy of Aquinas can help us with a contemporary problem. And that problem is that we just don't seem to know how to talk to each other anymore. In 2007, J.P. Moreland said, "Our political discourse is shrill and spoken in sound bites." And that was about 9 years ago, and it's only gotten much worse since then. Now, politicians in the U.S. are so bad at getting along that you can make some legitimate arguments that their political squabbling is putting the United States in danger. For example, in this article, Bill Scheimerin argues that America's political gridlock has made it unable to act against ISIS and other Islamic terrorists, and as such, it puts those groups in a position where they could possibly win in open combat because the politicians are all arguing instead of doing anything. And rather than encouraging Christians to share the love of Christ, the internet seems to have encouraged a significant amount of them to behave badly. In this article, Diane Klewa, I guess that's how you pronounce that, is concerned that there is now a third type of Christian apologist on the internet who is mean-spirited, arrogant, uses hard profanity, and in general just doesn't behave at all like Christ. Now, I can easily find many, many more examples of this, especially if I broaden it to political examples, and I'm sure you can think of many yourself. Now, Calvin and Hobbes will give us a great illustration of this particular problem. So, how we got to this issue in this place that Calvin seems to understand pretty well is a difficult question that I'll just have to leave for another time. But I've thought that since Aquinas addressed a great many issues and controversies in his day, he might be able to give us some examples and lessons on how we can fix this problem. Well, he said very little about rhetoric and persuasion directly. I think there's much we can learn about how to engage with opposing ideas from his style, teaching, and the truly charitable approach he takes to arguments and issues. The essay explores 6 lessons that Aquinas' teaching and writing offers on persuasions, and illustrates those points with contemporary examples, both good and bad. Those 6 lessons are: know the opposing positions and arguments, be fair and even-handed, find a common foundation, don't dehumanize other people, don't use logic as a club, and remember that truth and certainty are not identical. In presenting the contemporary examples, I avoided examples from politics and only used people who were considered experts or very knowledgeable in their field. I avoided politics because it's, just way too easy to find examples there, and the reality is I'll lose about half the people as soon as I'm critical in any way of one party or the other, which helps illustrate the problem. Further, by only using the examples from experts, I hope to avoid citing ignorant people and people who simply just don't know any better. If a random news reporter or internet blogger makes some of these mistakes, well, maybe they didn't know any better. But I don't think the same can be said of people who have their PhDs and regularly engage in high-level discussions. And of course, I'm going to be using Calvin and Hobbes comics to illustrate many of the points because I can do this, and it makes things far, far more entertaining. So, the first lesson we learn is knowing opposing positions and arguments. Aquinas understood not only his own positions, but he also understood his opponents, and in many cases he probably understood their case better than they did. In the Summa Theologica and the Summa Contra Gentiles, he always listed the objections to his position as forcefully and fairly as he could. With only one exception, he always finds and responds to several different objections. That exception is his article on the existence of God, where he can only find two objections to the existence of God in the whole history of human thought. And those two objections are the problem of evil and the apparent adequacy of the natural sciences to explain what we see. Now, Aquinas is regarded as such an authority on his opposition that there are now some philosophers of religion who argue that those really are the only two arguments against the existence of God. So the first practice Aquinas demonstrates is to know and understand the opposing arguments. So we should not just know caricatures that are easily dismissed, but the strongest and most robust objections that can be found. As an example of this, I'll turn again to Calvin and Hobbes. Now, obviously, the joke here depends on Calvin knowing his dad. So you would think that since our sarcastic 6-year-old here grasped this point, it would be very obvious and well understood by pretty much everybody. But then you'd be wrong. And for example, we have some critics of intelligent design who can't seem to be bothered to even read intelligent design material. And a good example of this is Darwin's Doubt. Stephen Meyer published this book in 2013, in which he argues that Darwinian evolution is unable to adequately explain the emergence of numerous different animal phyla in the Cambrian explosion. Now, 5 weeks before the book was published, the biologist Jerry Coyne claimed that Darwin's Doubt argues baby Jesus made the phyla. 1 day after the book was available to order, Nicholas Mensky published a book review that was 9,400 words long. Metsky's review doesn't address the book's arguments, attributes quotations to Meyer that don't appear in the book, and only quotes 156 words from a book that is over 500 pages long. In the second edition of the book, Meyer indicates that he accepts Metsky's explanation for how it was possible to write so lengthy of a review of so lengthy a book in so little time. While I think Meyer deserves some praise for his efforts of being charitable, the most reasonable explanation is that Metsky simply couldn't be bothered to read the book he was criticizing. Now, for comparison, the essay this presentation is based on is about 9,200 words long if we exclude the abstract and the bibliography, and it took me much, much longer than 1 day to research and write this essay. Now, we see a further example of this problem in the book Philosophy of Science, A Very Short Introduction. For this book, the author, Samir Okasha, seems to have neglected to read any arguments for intelligent design. In the section Science and Religion, he only addresses arguments that evolution is, quote, just a theory, and that the fossil record is too spotty to prove evolution before concluding that, quote, the arguments of creation scientists are uniformly unsound. Now, the trouble is that much better arguments for intelligent design had been proposed years earlier. This book was published in 2002. In 1996, Michael Behe argued for the concept of irreducible complexity in Darwin's Black Box, and in 1998, William Dembski argued for specified complexity in his book, The Design Inference. And those are actually two separate, interesting, and distinct arguments. Now, they're both also prominent and pretty well-known intelligent design arguments. I mean, they get caricatured all the time, so they're obviously well-known. And so it seems really bizarre that Okasha didn't mention or even address them. You could argue that maybe he didn't know the arguments existed, but then that kind of begs the question of why he included a section on science and religion in his book if he wasn't even going to thoroughly research the topic. A failure to address, much less mention, the prominent arguments of your opposition only shows that you didn't bother to find out what the opposition claims are. Now, I'll also note here that none of this, in any way demonstrates that intelligent design arguments are good arguments or that they're true. What it shows us is that critics of ID, at least some of them, can't be bothered to actually read the material they're saying is wrong and that they're criticizing. Now, on the other hand, Kevin Sharp really took Aquinas' advice to heart for his exchange with William Lane Craig at Ohio State University back in February of this year. To prepare, Sharp gained extensive knowledge of Craig's arguments in philosophy by listening to all 7 years of Craig's weekly podcast, Reasonable Faith. Now, if we assume that each one of Craig's podcasts is about 20 minutes long, that's going to equal over 121 hours of podcasts. Quite a time commitment. But as a result, the two men were able to have a really substantive exchange on how the probabilities of the premises of an argument translate to the probability of its conclusions in relation to some of the arguments for God's existence. Afterward, Craig said that he really appreciated how prepared Sharp was and that it enabled them to have a really good exchange on some of these issues because we have here an opponent who came really prepared. So, following Aquinas' method of knowing your opposition takes a lot of work, as Kevin Sharp demonstrates for us, but it always allows for more rigorous and fruitful engagement. Really, no one's going to read the critiques of Coyne, Metzke, or Akasha and conclude that, yep, they've shown that intelligent design doesn't work, because they didn't even bother to engage with the arguments. So what we should all do is follow J.P. Moreland's advice and expose yourself to ideas with which you disagree, and let yourself be motivated to excel intellectually by the exposure. The point is to spend time around those who do not simply reinforce your own way of looking at things. And this leads right into the next point. When Aquinas is presenting and arguing against opposing viewpoints, he does so in such a fair and even-handed fashion that even his philosophical opponents recognize it. Bertrand Russell, and we got a picture of him there, said of Aquinas, when he wished to refute some doctrine, he states it first, often with great force, and almost always with an attempt at fairness. The sharpness and clarity with which he distinguishes argument derived from reason and arguments derived from revelation are admirable. Now, Russell was certainly Aquinas' rival philosophically. He was not only an anti-Christian atheist, he also disparaged Aquinas as a philosopher, saying, there is little of the true philosophic spirit in Aquinas. He does not, like the Platonic Socrates, set out to follow wherever the arguments may lead. Now, it seems in this statement that Russell's failing to follow Aquinas' good example, as he is characterizing and dismissing Aquinas far too quickly. However, Aquinas was so fair and even-handed that even when he dismissed Aquinas, Russell was also forced to contradict his own criticism and admit that Aquinas states very fairly the arguments that have been brought against orthodox position. Illustrating this point, Peter Kreeft summarizes Aquinas' treatment on the question of what the good is. Aquinas' treatment of it is the most objective, scientific treatment you could imagine, a perfect example of how he combines profundity with clarity. His method is to rely on empirical observation and logical argument alone. There's no emotional appeal, no rhetoric, no personal winks or kicks or preachings. So, in knowing his opposition so well and so consistently fairly representing them, Aquinas demonstrated the very charity he spoke of before. As a direct consequence, it is virtually never said of Aquinas that he doesn't know what he was talking about, and it is really hard to dismiss it. In this case, Lawrence Krauss provides an example of exactly what not to do. At a debate with William Lane Craig in 2013, Krauss produced an email from the cosmologist Alexander Vilenkin. Krauss claimed that this email contradicted Craig's arguments and conclusion. In his debate, it's an published work, Craig is very fond of citing the Born-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, or BGV, as proof that the universe had a beginning. The email made it seem as though Vilenkin, one of the authors of this theorem, had serious doubts that the theorem actually established the beginning of the universe. However, Craig noticed that the email contained several ellipses points. When he asked Krauss about this, Krauss responded that the material was dropped off because it was, quote, technical. After the debate, Craig contacted Vilenkin and another cosmologist for clarification. It turned out that Krauss had omitted several key phrases that dramatically changed the tone and meaning of Vilenkin's email. In the email's full text, Vilenkin expressed caution that there is no absolute certainty in science, and explained the theorem only works if its assumption is granted, but he also indicated that alternate methods and models of avoiding the beginning of the universe don't show much promise and are rife with problems. So it seems unavoidable that Krauss misrepresented the email he received from Vilenkin in an attempt to bolster his arguments against Craig. Now, misrepresenting and misquoting people in an attempt to make your own case look better is at the least an unfair tactic. Conversely, J.P. Moreland tells us he tries to be very fair and even-handed when he's critiquing the emerging church. In his book, Kingdom Triangle, he begins by praising the emerging church and calls them my brothers and sisters. Only then does he offer his critique that they are too enraptured with postmodern language and thought. To illustrate this point, Moreland tells a short story about the late philosopher Hilary Putnam, and incidentally, I found out after I wrote this essay that Putnam only died a few months before I wrote it, I believe in March of this year, March of 2016. He lived 89 years, but it's still sad and tragic, because it's always sad and tragic to lose a great mind. So anyhow, Moreland relates a story of how Putnam attended a dinner party where the hostess remarked that science had taught that the universe is an uncaring, purposeless, valueless machine. Moreland thinks this really struck Putnam and encouraged him to move from a strict naturalism toward a form of relativistic constructionism. He thinks that Putnam could not face the meaninglessness of life in a cold, blind, material universe, and moved in a postmodern direction according to which reality, value, and truth are arbitrary conventions relative to different cultures. Moreland also adds that while postmodernism is a very diverse movement, if you regard postmodernism as problematizing our access to truth by rejecting things like the correspondence theory of truth and the objectivity of reason, then Putnam's move was a postmodern move. Now, this is a fair way to address the emerging church because Moreland takes pains to temper his criticism with praise, and he addresses them by telling a story. Leaders of the emerging church movement have expressed skepticism and suspicion of things like deductive arguments, but they've also praised the use of storytelling. So by addressing them in the manner they prefer, Moreland demonstrates that he's trying to meet them where they are. Further, the story he tells about Putnam does seem somewhat analogous to the emerging church, as they typically have a skeptical attitude toward absolutes and fundamentals, but they also want to embrace meaning, value, and people. Moreland reflects the idea that Ravi Zacharias put well. I must state that one can be gracious in disagreeing, and that everyone has a right to his or her own belief. So now we're going to see Calvin demonstrate for us how to have a very unfair conversation. Now, Aquinas also argues that people from different religions, political ideals, philosophies, etc., will recognize different systems of authority and foundations. As such, he encourages Christians not to reason with Muslims as they would with Jews, and not to reason with either group as they would with other Christians. As the Jews do not accept the authority of the New Testament, they must be reasoned with from the Old Testament, and likewise the, quote, Muslims and pagans accept neither the one nor the other. We must therefore have recourse to natural reason, to which all men are forced to give their assent. Now, what Aquinas is explaining here is that to begin persuading and discussing things, two opposing parties must find some common ground to work with, or a common authority to submit to. A Jew, a Muslim, and a pagan, and here we have Socrates stepping in to represent the pagans for us, he's good like that, all have different foundations than a Christian does. So we need to reason with all of them from those different foundations, or, find a common foundation that's deeper down to work from. And we can see examples of this principle everywhere. When two United States citizens are in conflict, they can, and usually should, submit to the authority of the U.S. judicial system. When two philosophers disagree, they can, hopefully, both appeal to the common ground of the validity of logic and reason. Sometimes that common foundation may be very far down indeed. Nominalists, realists, and idealists might have to do some very deep digging to find some common ground. Perhaps the only thing they can agree on is that some things actually exist. But as weak as that is, even that is a place to start from. Ralph McInerny said that we seem to find here, as we often find elsewhere, that when intelligent men disagree, they may, on a more profound level, be in agreement. Not every argument and issue can be approached the same way, and likewise Aquinas teaches us that different people and groups of people should be approached in different ways. Now, the late Richard Rorty's arguments that religion should be privatized was an example of I think, sincere, but also failed effort to find common ground. He explained that the main reason religion needs to be privatized is that, in political discussion with those outside the relevant religious community, it is a conversation stopper. Rorty argued that it would be unfair and unjust to exclude religious people from political discussions, and good for him for that, but since atheists like himself don't accept religious premises, it is best for religious people to just leave their initial premises at home and engage in political discussion without those premises. He claimed that surely the fact that one of us gets his premises in church and the other in a library is, and should be of, no entrance to our audience in the public square. The arguments that take place there, political arguments, are best thought of as neither religious nor non-religious. But this doesn't work because, as Timothy Keller and others jump in and to point out, all claims about what ought to be will fall back to premises that some group of people don't have access to. As soon as we start to say society ought to be like this or like that, we're arguing from a worldview. So to borrow Rorty's terms, the secular atheist is going to have initial premises that are just as much a conversation stopper to a conservative Christian as vice versa. Keller explains this problem with the example of divorce laws. Traditional-minded cultures typically have the understanding that the individual exists for the good of the family or the community, whereas much of the Western Enlightenment ideal says that the individual's happiness is what's most important. So, quote, those from a traditional culture and have that understanding of the meaning of life are going to want getting a divorce to be difficult, and those from a Western Enlightenment understanding of individualism are going to want getting a divorce to be easy, because they think the purpose of marriage is the fulfillment of the two individuals. The question of if the individual or the community should take precedence is largely determined by the worldview of the people in question. And the premises that come from worldviews, not just religious worldviews, I mean all worldviews, are what Rorty called conversation stoppers. So Rorty's attempt to find common ground by asking religious people to just leave their premises at home doesn't work, because if everyone would have to do that and leave all their premises at home, and if everyone did that, there'd be no way for us to really talk about anything. Now, on the other hand, I think an excellent example of finding common ground is how Stephen Schwartz and Kiki Latimer refer to the unborn child as the being in the womb, or BIW, in their book Understanding Abortion. They recognize that a fundamental question in the whole abortion issue is the question, is the BIW a merely biological organism or a person? That is, it is the actual status of the BIW that is in dispute, and the language the two sides use betrays their positions. The pro-life position is that the BIW is a person, and so they always refer to it as a child or a baby, and I kind of gave myself away there that I'm pro-life by instinctively I started referring to it as a baby. On the other hand, the pro-choice side maintains that the BIW is not a person, and so refers to it by the technical and medical term fetus. Recognizing that the terms used can favor one side over the other, Schwartz and Latimer explain, quote, when presenting a particular side, I shall use the term favored by that side. In other contexts, to assure objectivity, I shall use a neutral term, the being in the womb, BIW, an expression that leaves open its status. The term being is used here in a broad and very general philosophical sense. Now, no doubt both sides are going to bristle a little bit at the use of the term being in the womb, but in order for abortion to be discussed rationally, some term must be used to refer to the unborn child or fetus, and both of those two terms do seem to prejudice the discussion a bit. So by finding a term that doesn't prejudice this discussion, Schwartz and Latimer have found some common ground between the pro-life and pro-choice positions. Now, it's worth noting here that there are some philosophies and schools of thought that seek to deny even the possibility of finding common ground. Peter Kreeft says, St. Thomas Aquinas abandoned his impersonal, objective, and scrupulous fair language and reverted to persona insults only for the most extreme and absurd of errors, such as David of Dennett, who identified God with prime matter, and Siger of Brabant, who maintained that the same position can be both true in theology and false in philosophy at the same time. To place my infant steps in those of the Master, I therefore reserve my right to do the same appropriate name-calling to point out the unparalleled absurdity of the philosophy that denies even this minimal truth, the truth that words have meaning, i.e., deconstructionism. Unfortunately, common ground cannot be found with those who deny basic logic and claim that words have no meaning. Such positions claim that there is no foundation for anyone to stand on, and as such there is no common ground to find with them because they're denying the existence of such common ground. The only remaining recourse, I think, is to do as Kreeft suggests and point out the ridiculous, absurd, and self-contradictory nature of their claims. Reasonable people will probably be persuaded by such things. And for people who deny the authority of even basic reason, well, Aristotle called them vegetables for a reason. So, the point here is that when two people are in conflict, they need to recognize if they have different foundations, and then find a deeper one to appeal to. But strong deconstructionism denies the existence of such foundations. So then the foundations go away. Without any foundation, everyone is essentially lost without a referent or an anchor. No one has the right to claim or argue anything, as no one has a foundation. But this also holds for the deconstructionist, as if no one has a foundation, then neither does he. And as such, his claims are self-contradictory and collapse, and that's why he goes away, because if no one has a foundation, neither does he. And that's why Aristotle called such people vegetables. Strong deconstructionism is self-refuting. So here we're going to see an example of where Calvin tries to find some common ground with his dad. Aquinas' teachings on man and his relation to God and reason also remind us that the opposition are actual human beings. Quoting Augustine, Aquinas says, "All men agree in desiring the last end, which is happiness." Now this is similar to Plato's, and perhaps Socrates' idea that all men desire the good. Now if these three titans of philosophy, that is Plato, Augustine, and Aquinas, are correct that no one desires evil and suffering, but that all men and women desire to be good and happy, then it follows that no matter how vile and evil the opposition is, or how ridiculous and absurd their position is, in some way and in some sense, they believe they are doing something right and pursuing something that will make them or other people happy. They may be wrong, and perhaps in some sense or in some way some of them do have bad intentions, but unless these three great philosophers are all wrong, in some way and in some sense, everyone does have some good intentions. So, Aquinas' teaching humanizes the opposition by demonstrating that we have no faceless enemies, only other human beings that stand in opposition to our beliefs, religions, philosophies, ideals, and so on. Now, one of the dangers of arguing rationally is that arguments can become too abstract and reductionistic and reduce people to things. Despite his clearly good intentions, Paul Witz demonstrates this in his essay, The Psychology of Atheism. Witz argues that atheists usually have problems with their fathers. Their fathers abandoned them as children, were weak men, abused them, and so on. Now, it is a well-argued and evidenced essay in that Witz is able to point to many examples of prominent atheists who had troubles with their fathers, such as Bertrand Russell, and so on. He is even cautious enough to warn that a psychological theory can't be right all the time. We're lucky in psychology if we're right, say, 60 or 70% of the time. But the first trouble with this is the knife will cut both ways. Let's suppose that Witz is right, and all or most atheists have defective fathers. If atheism is reduced to nothing more than father trouble, doesn't it reasonably follow that theism might be reduced to nothing more than the contrary? That is, if you have a good father, like I did, you're likely to believe in God, like me, as opposed to Bertrand Russell, who had trouble with his father and wound up being an atheist. And if that's the case, wouldn't that reduce all arguments for and against God to basically useless verbiage? If the only or primary reason people believe or disbelieve in God is their relationship with their father, then any rational argument or discussion on the matter is a waste of time, because it's not touching on the actual reasons people have for their belief or disbelief in God. But wait, this still gets worse. D.Q. McHenry once said that the proper study of man as he truly is, the whole man. If psychology is not concerned with studying the whole man, then it ends up dealing with the products of professional imaginings and not with realities. Now, this isn't to argue that Witz produced something of professional imaginings. Rather, it's to claim that by reducing atheism to defective fathers, he is now dealing with less than the whole man. As such, he is dehumanizing the atheists he is citing, even though he's doing it, I think, inadvertently and unintentionally. And if you're having trouble seeing this point, connecting this here to help you grasp it, just consider how you would react if someone told you you only believed in something because you had a great childhood or because you were born in a certain country. Now, in one sense, that might be true, but in another sense, this is reducing your beliefs to accidental things. You didn't have any control over your childhood, at least for the most part. You didn't have any control over where you were born. Now, it gets worse when you claim that you have good reasons for your beliefs or disbeliefs. If you do claim that and you are still told you only believe because of those accidental things, you should feel slighted because you are not being taken seriously and at that point are being treated as less than human. Now, I think it's clear that Witz didn't intend to dehumanize anyone in this essay, but by reducing atheist belief to father trouble, he isn't taking the atheists seriously and he isn't showing their humanity respect, especially because the vast majority of the atheists he cites claimed they had reasons for their disbelief in God. So, rather than reduce people to things, we should do as Richard Foster suggests, and not pray for people as things, but as persons whom we love. Now, on the other hand, Francis Schaeffer relates an encounter where he appealed to his opponent's humanity. He mentions a time when he was crossing the Mediterranean Sea and met a young married atheist who anticipated entertainment upon finding out that Schaeffer was a pastor. But it didn't go quite that way. After an hour's conversation, Schaeffer saw that the young man tried to be consistent and understood the implications of his position. The man was accompanied by his lovely wife, and it was plain that he loved her. So as they were leaving, Schaeffer made one last point, quote, "Not because I hated him, but because I cared for him as a fellow human being. I finally said to him, when you take your wife into your arms at night, can you be sure she is there? I hated to do it to him, but I did it knowing he was a man who would really understand the implications of the question and not forget. He shouted at me, 'No, I am not always sure she is there.' I am sure I spoiled his last night on the Mediterranean, and I was sorry to do so. But I pray that as long as he lives he will never forget that his system could not stand, not on some abstract point, but on the central point of his own humanity, in the reality of love." Now, if we start conversations and debates by doing things like asking an atheist if he can be sure of his wife's existence, then we'll lose the person even if we win the argument. On the other hand, what Schaeffer did here, he only did it after engaging with this person for an hour, so that he could recognize that such an appeal might show the man that his system of thought denied the very humanity that both he and Schaeffer valued, and so denied the reality of the love he felt for his wife. Now, on the other hand, Calvin will actually dispute the claim of Aquinas, Augustine, and Plato that all men desire happiness. Sometimes the best way not to dehumanize someone is to just shut your mouth and be quiet, apparently. Aquinas also argues that free will is part of man's dignity. Now, arguments about how free will aside for the moment, this demonstrates to us that people don't appreciate it when they think they are being forced into something, even the conclusion of a sound argument. Alexander Vilenkin gave a great example of the distinction between an argument and a proof when he said, "It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man." And while it is true to assert that on pain of irrationality someone must accept the conclusion of a sound deductive argument, what Aquinas is reminding us here is that it is likely in such a situation people will feel their dignity is being assaulted, and instead of being persuaded, they will bristle and hunker down. Hence, instead of using arguments and logic as a means of force, they should be used to persuade in the sense of an invitation. James W. Sire tells a cautionary story about a time in class he attempted to force a student to see a self-contradiction, only to have it backfire on him. Suddenly a student called out, "But communication is impossible." I replied, with considerable wit I thought, "What?" He said it again. "People can't communicate." I replied, "What?" Again he repeated himself, and I did too. At that point he got angry and walked out. Cleverness is one thing, but it is to be used with caution. Not only did I lose the audience with the student, but I discovered as well that others in the room did not understand what had happened. They were lost to me as well. Now, on the other hand, as an example of using logic to invite rather than force, I'll point to Stephen Schwartz's variant of Pascal's wager. He argues that Pascal's wager, as he formulated it, is incomplete rather than defective. Schwartz breaks up his version into 4 different levels, for each level there are 2 key points. He splits it up into 4 possibilities. 1, God is. 2, God is not. 3, I seek him. And 4, I don't seek him. Now the vertical lines here are uninteresting for our purposes here. That's where it is when you're right about God as a theist or an atheist. The first important term Schwartz terms faith diagonals. These diagonals are the position where what we believe about God is wrong. So we believe that God exists and he does not, or we believe that he does exist and he doesn't. I got that a little backwards there, but I think you see the point. Now, Schwartz's second point is non-parallelism, which he suggests is the real essence of Pascal's wager. It is, I submit, a profound insight into a truth of great importance, namely, that terrible as it would be to believe God is when he is not, it is incomparably worse to not believe he exists when he does exist. That is, it's tragic if God doesn't exist and you believe in him, but Schwartz argues that it's always worse to not believe in God if he exists, as missing out on a God of love is a much greater tragedy than simply being wrong. So that brings us back to options A and B there, those diagonal lines. This is where the non-parallelism and faith diagonals come in, as what Schwartz is arguing is that option B will always be much objectively worse than option A. It is objectively better to err in one direction than the other, because not believing when God is means failure to give the value response due to God as infinite goodness. Now the clincher here is that Schwartz argues the wager should compel us to investigate God further, not that it should compel you to believe God exists. So after hearing this wager, you should then go out and do what you can to see if the claim that God exists is true. By splitting the wager up like this, Schwartz allows the wager a more modest function of demonstrating that it is in our own interest to find out if there is a God of love. I'll also note here that I find this to be a far stronger and far more compelling version of Pascal's wager than the one that is usually talked about and debated. If you are all at all interested in Pascal's wager, I encourage you to study this version, as it quite literally beats the pants off of all other versions, including Pascal's original one. So, all people can be shown the truth, but no one can be forced to accept it, and attempting such force, even if only through logic and reason, usually assaults a person's dignity and often does more harm than good. Not even God forces all men unto himself. Rather, he desires that all men come unto him and calls on us to reason with him. And I've got a great example here where Hobbes will show us the force of reason. And now we come to the last point, and that's that Aquinas teaches that there is a distinction between the truth and our own perceptions. Referring back to Augustine, he says that first of all we should hold the truth of Scripture without wavering. The second is that since Holy Scripture can be explained in a multiplicity of senses, one should adhere to a particular explanation only in such measure as to be ready to abandon it if it is proved with certainty to be false, lest Holy Scripture be exposed to the ridicule of unbelievers and obstacles be placed to their believing. So Aquinas teaches that I must accept that I might be wrong. He is making the point that it is important to hold to what is true, but at the same time all reasonable people need to be prepared to accept that they may be wrong. The fact that a pious medieval Catholic like St. Thomas Aquinas is making this point in relation to Holy Scripture shows just how serious he is about it. And it seems to be the case that in the case of a few Christian denominations, his prediction that such an irrational certainty would lead to unbelievers ridiculing Holy Scripture has come true. So, Aquinas teaches that while the truth is above everyone, no man or woman is the arbiter of the truth. Now, this will touch on many different areas and could get controversial in the areas like epistemology and hermeneutics, and I'm going to do my best to avoid going down too many rabbit trails here, but I think it can be fairly and succinctly said that while there is objective truth, as we all have imperfect, imprecise, and incomplete perceptions, none of us can claim absolute certainty about the truth, i.e., our interpretation of the truth. There is the truth, and we all have imperfect, imprecise, and incomplete perceptions of that truth, or that is, our own ideas. So, we should all hold to interpretations, but this is not necessarily the same thing as objective reality. As Dallas Willard put it, we should recognize and hold on to the distinction between truth itself and particular truths in plural. And of course, it will follow from this that some people are just going to have better ideas than others. As you can see here, guys like the Greek philosopher and Aquinas have a much better idea about what's going on than Calvin does. So, when there is overwhelming evidence that our interpretation is not a good reflection of the truth, we need to abandon our interpretation in favor of another one that is a better reflection of the truth. The thing to avoid here are the equal but opposing errors of believing that we know the truth perfectly and of believing that there is no truth. That is, we want to avoid naive realism and strong deconstructionism. Practically speaking, this means that unless you happen to be God, it's always possible that you were wrong, and you should be prepared to abandon false ideas and beliefs when they are proved with certainty to be false. Now, technically and philosophically speaking, we don't know truth in degrees. Rather, what we all know are some true propositions and there are some false ones that we think to be true. For example, right now I believe the true proposition that I'm sitting in my chair in front of my computer, talking into a microphone, making this presentation, and there's many other true propositions. Right now, if you're watching this, you believe the true one that you're watching a presentation made by me. And we can list them all, but that's not really important here. The point is that some people, like Aquinas and, say, Socrates, are going to know many more true propositions and far less false ones than someone like, let's just say, Calvin. Aquinas and Socrates have done the hard work of considering life and thinking through things in great detail, and Calvin has not, so they know much more than Calvin. That is, we can say they know more true propositions than Calvin does. But as no human being knows everything, even very wise men like Aquinas and Socrates don't know all the true propositions. Only God knows that. Further, because we are all fallible human beings, we can be wrong. Even Socrates and Aquinas will have ideas that they think are true, that is, there'll be propositions that they think are true, that it actually turns out are false. And that's why no one, not me, you, not Socrates, Aquinas, or Calvin, can claim absolute certainty. Anyone who does either doesn't understand this point or isn't being intellectually honest. Now, there are many disciplines that intuitively recognize the distinction between truth and an interpretation of the truth, like archaeology, history, and some types of literary criticism. Problems only recognize when they typically only arise when we fail to see this distinction and don't recognize that our idea is not necessarily the truth. And as an example, we have this guy who popped up a little bit early, and it's Peter Atkins. He says that scientists who believe in God are wrong and only half scientists. Asked about God, he says, well, it's fairly straightforward. There isn't one, and there's no evidence for one, no reason to believe that there is one, so I don't believe that there is one. And I think it's rather foolish that people do think there is one. John Lennox explained that for those like Atkins, thinking about God is like thinking about Father Christmas, dragons, hobgoblins, or fairies and leprechauns at the bottom of the garden. Atkins' trouble is that he seems to think he has the truth about God's non-existence, so he has no respect for anyone who sees it differently from him. Since he has the truth, everyone else must certainly be wrong. If Atkins simply recognized his own limitations and the fact that he might be wrong, he might be a little more open to discussion. The late Henry Morris seemed to have the same problem when he claimed that Genesis teaches a 6-day creation week and that, quote, this literal interpretation is the only one that satisfies all biblical data. Now, as this quotation is from a book where Morris spends over 250 pages attempting to give reasons for this claim, I'm not arguing here that he had no reasons for this claim or that it's an unreasonable one in any way. The point here is that Morris thought his was the only interpretation that satisfied the data. In effect, he was saying that he had the only reasonable interpretation, and so he had the truth, or at least a far better interpretation of the truth than anyone else. That is, he was certain he was right. So both these men think they have the truth, and they should be certain of it, when the reality is they should not be so certain of it, as they only have their idea. That is the error to avoid, and Calvin will demonstrate for us where this type of thinking leads to. Now, on the other hand, a positive example of this distinction is found in a story Peter Kreeft tells about making his philosophy of religion students debate the existence of God. And I have a short clip of it.
By the way, when I teach philosophy of religion, I always do this little experiment when it comes to the question of the existence of God. I divide the class into two. I say, how many think you can prove the existence of God? And about half of them say yes. And how many here believe either there's no God, or there's probably no God, or at least you can't prove him? And that's the other half. Okay. Now I say, all you skeptics are going to have to argue. We're going to have a debate. Go on different sides of the room. All you skeptics are going to have to argue for the existence of God. And all you believers are going to have to argue for atheism. They protest, but I say, unless you understand the other position, you can't really argue against it, can you? So they say, okay, we'll do it. Every single time I've done that, I've done it maybe 4 or 5 times, the result is the same. I don't orchestrate it, I just let them argue. And everybody agrees at the end that the Christians pretending to be atheists win the debate. Atheism defeats theism. And then I ask why. And the atheist said, well, you made us argue for this silly fairy tale called Christianity, which is so ridiculous that nobody could possibly argue for it. You gave us the weakest case. And then the theists who are pretending to be atheists say, no, you gave the weakest, most ridiculously weak arguments for theism. We've got dozens of stronger ones that you never heard of, but we gave your strongest arguments for atheism, and you couldn't answer them. And then they argue whether that's the case or not. That's the real argument.
So, by putting the theists in the atheist shoes and vice versa, Kreeft is encouraging his students to realize that they might be wrong. It's possible the other side has good arguments that you have never considered, and if you are going to argue against the opposing side's position, you need to seriously consider their arguments. So perhaps your understanding of the truth isn't perfect, and you could learn something from the other side that gives you a little better understanding, i.e., perhaps you shouldn't have such a high level of certainty. So that's the last lesson that Kreeft teaches us there. Now, Kreeft's example will also encourage the students to know the opposing arguments. For the same reason, it pushes the students toward being fair in how they present the arguments and criticize the same. It also puts the students on the common ground of arguing against what they actually believe, and so it encourages them to see each other as actual human beings. The only part of my essay that Kreeft's story doesn't directly demonstrate is not using logic as a club, the 5th point. But I think if he can get his students to do the other ones, this one probably will just follow as well. Now, all these points build on and support each other. The more you know about what the opposition thinks, the easier it is to be fair to them. The more you see the opposition as actual human beings, the easier it is to find common ground with them and not beat them over the head with logic. And the more you learn about everything, the easier it will be to recognize that as only God can have absolute certainty, you might be wrong. Now, this is all very much in the spirit of the following quotation. It's said that Thomas Aquinas, who knew more about education and persuasion than almost anybody who ever lived, once said that when you want to convert someone to your point of view, you go over to where he is standing, take him by the hand, mentally speaking, and guide him to where you want him to go. You don't stand across the room and shout at him. You don't call him a dummy. You don't order him to come over to where you are. You start where he is and work from that position, and that's the only way to get him to change. Now, but when you do some digging, you'll find out that Aquinas didn't actually really say this. Rather, this quotation is a very loose rendering of a principle that Aquinas advocated for of going from what is known to what is unknown. But, as we can see from these other points, the idea and sentiment in it is definitely something that Aquinas embraced. Now, we just need to do the same. So at this point, if it were a live presentation, I would ask for questions. I once heard the late Dallas Willard, who was one of my favorite philosophers, say that anyone who talks for 45 minutes or more is bound to say at least a couple of things that are profoundly wrong, and it looks like I've been going on for about 50 minutes, so if you know where in this 50 minutes I was profoundly wrong, I suggest you send me a message, an email, or just leave a comment. And quickly, I've got 3 pages of sources if you feel like looking any of these up or tracking any of them down.